In the summer of 1898, the landlord of the Tankard Tavern at Kennington faced a menace that did not swagger with a gang nor carry the authority of a warder's truncheon. His trouble announced itself with the clatter of falling glass and threats hissed like steam. A woman who promised vitriol in his face and made good, again and again, on her vow to shatter his windows. The person behind this private siege was not some hulking bully. It was Charlotte Charlton, barely 4'8", a figure the newspapers would come to label a fury, a window smasher, a danger. How did this small woman acquire such a fearful reputation? To understand that, you have to walk back into the records and let them speak. The first official trace of her isn't a headline at all, but a grid of names and occupations inked across the 1861 census for England and Wales. There in South Hackney, far from the South London streets that will later echo with her arrests, appears a teenage servant, Charlotte Bank. She's 14, already earning, but still living under her parents' roof. The household is intimate and plainly industrious. Her father, William Bancraftoft, 43, is a bootmaker. Her mother, also Charlotte, 39, binds boots. Read between the lines, and you can see a family workshop, the sort of small domestic manufacture common in London's leather districts. Lasts, awls and offcuts cluttering a back room, light pooling on the bench, the day measured by orders and deliveries. William's birthplace is the city of Bath. His wife and daughter were born south of the Thames in Bermondsey, old leather territory. The entry quietly testifies to movement. At some point before 1861, the family had crossed the river to Hackney in search of steadier work or cheaper rent. For a working-class girl already in service, the next step in those years was almost always swift marriage. 4 years after that census, on 11th June 1865 at St Jude's in Suffolk, an entry is made. Charlotte Bancraftoft, 18, weds John Charlton, 23. The venue on the south side suggests she has returned to the streets of her birth. What hopes they spoke under that church roof are not recorded. What is recorded is a family that grows. The couple will have 4 sons, John, Alfred, Charles, and Albert, names that appear like signposts in later documents. Bright for a moment, and then dimmed. Barely 3 years into the marriage, the paper trail jerks into sharp focus, with reports that make for stark reading. July 1868. One notice in the Daily Telegraph mentions a benevolent subscription, a sovereign sent by Sir Charles Daver Crosley to reward a sailor, Thomas Banfield, who had risked his life to save a woman from drowning near London Bridge on Sunday last. The name is there. The rescued woman was Charlotte Charlton. Strip away the polite phrasing and you have this: a young mother pulled alive from the Thames. Another report, the following day in the Weekly. Dispatch is colder and more precise. From the Suffolk Police Court, it states that Charlotte Charlton, a respectable-looking young woman, was charged with attempting to drown herself. The constable's evidence fixes the time between 7 and 8 in the evening, a Tuesday, not Sunday. The courtroom details are vivid and brutally human. From his brig, the Maria, moored at Fenning's Wharf, Banfield heard the cry, "A woman overboard." He leapt fully clothed into the river, lost his boots and cap fighting the current, kept her head above water until a lifebuoy reached them, and then they were hauled ashore. Charlotte was taken to hospital. Asked the reason for her act, she said she was sorry, and that a quarrel with her husband had driven her to it. The magistrate reprimanded her and ordered 15 shillings to reimburse Banfield's lost garments. The report adds one detail that refuses to leave the mind. Charlotte stood in court holding an infant. Set that image beside the family register, and another piece slides into place. The child born around that time, 1868, was Alfred. In the 1871 census, when Charlotte and John are living at Oxbridge Place in Newington, only 2 boys are listed with them. John, 5, and Charles, 1. The elder child is described with a harsh Victorian term for disability, a label common in records of that era, clinical and unkind. Alfred, the baby who would have been about 3 in 1871, is missing. The reason is not a mystery once you reach for the death record. Alfred William James Charlton dies on 22nd July 1868, 3 months old. The father's occupation is given as painter, matching John Charlton's trade as a house decorator in the 1871 return. The cause of death is recorded as TABES, one of those elastic Victorian diagnoses covering wasting disease in infants, often linked to tuberculosis or chronic malnutrition. The certificate adds 2 final hammering facts. Alfred dies in the workhouse, and his mother is present at the end. Her residence is also listed as the Bermondsey Workhouse. Lay the dates side by side, and the week becomes unbearable in its compression. On 18 and 19th of July, the papers note a rescue from the Thames that had occurred days before. On 22nd of July, Alfred dies. In the space of a handful of nights and mornings, Charlotte quarrels with her husband, throws herself into the river, appears in a police court with a sick baby in her arms, and sits beside that same baby as he fades in the ward of a parish institution for the destitute. These are not the melodramatic inventions of a penny dreadful. They are the plain facts of a life crushed between domestic strain, poverty, and the hazards of the city. If later years show a woman quick to break glass and quicker to defy authority, these early pages tell you what ground she was standing on when she began to crack. After 1868, the sources go quiet for a time, as if the family withdraws behind its own door. When they reappear in 1871, Charlotte and John are together in Newington with 2 boys. There is no mention of Alfred because there cannot be. The census gives you the calm texture of a home. Addresses, ages, trades. It does not record the absence that sits at the table. But grief threads through the ordinary just the same. And with that unspoken pressure, you can feel the shape of later events beginning to form. The drift from husband and sons, the change of name, the search for shelter that becomes a pattern of lodging houses and shared rooms, the rattle of a stone against a pane. The next time the papers notice her, it will be under a different name at London Bridge, and the river will once again rise up black beneath the steps. The hush that follows a calamity rarely lasts. When the records break their silence again, Charlotte is back at the river. It is 1880, and a notice from the Mansion House Police Court sketches a scene so familiar it feels like a duplicate sheet pulled from the clerk's stack. A middle-aged woman is charged with attempting to drown herself at London Bridge. The report says she hurried down the steps and pitched into the water. A young man dived after her and hauled her out. She was not calm when questioned. She insisted she meant to carry through what she had begun. The detail that jolts is the name, not Charlotte Charlton, but Charlotte Bank. To anyone who knows the family story, Bank is not a random accident of spelling. It is a pared-down echo of her maiden name, Bancroft, reduced as if life had sanded it to the grain. Why this reversion? In the 1871 return, Charlotte is plainly living with husband, children, and mother. By 1880, the key witness who stands up in court is not a relative, but a housemate from the same address. The witness recalls a walk interrupted by an abrupt, chilling sentence, "Now I am going to do my business," before Charlotte bolts for the steps and the tide. It sounds like a life moved into lodgings and out of the family orbit. Middle-aged, the paper says, though by the calendar, she's only in her early 30s. If the reporter guessed wrong, the river did not. Its cold arithmetic matched the attempt in 1868 line for line. A sudden plunge, a stranger's courage, an officer's note, and a magistrate measuring out rebuke in sentences and shillings. The puzzle of names soon gains an answer, not from rumour, but from a neat printed schedule. The calendar of prisoners for the Middlesex sessions in 1884. There in a hand not her own, the ledger fixes her. Charlotte Charlton, 33. The charge is blunt, malicious damage to a pane of glass, valued at £8. She pleads guilty and receives 6 months in Millbank. Yet the most revealing column is the one that looks backward. Previous convictions are listed under other names entirely. In 1882 and 1883, there are entries for damage with the signature Emily Williams. And in August 1883, there is another under Emily Boyes-Haftoft, the latter a jagged shard of her birth name. The aliases blow away any lingering doubt about the 1880 bridge case. She has been wearing other names like Coats Taken from a Peg, Bank, Williams, a crookedly spelled Braftoft, whatever the moment requires to get through a door, a hearing, or a grim day's work. Property damage is now her refrain. Broken panes stand where earlier there were husband, son, and a heavy bundle in her arms. You can hear the philosophy of it in the dull thud of a stone and the bright, answering crack of glass. If life will not yield to pleading, it must be made to shiver. 2 years after Millbank, in December 1886, the Thames returns to claim her story once more. The South London papers record a constable watching her go off the steps near Suffolk Bridge, and then following her into the river to pull her out. The court notes that this is the second, possibly the third time she's been saved from those waters. The repetition starts to harden into a public identity, a woman whom the river knows by first name and chill. By 1890, her contact with institutions takes a stranger turn. A small report at Westminster records an incident that reads comic until you think about it twice. An ironer named Charlotte Charlton is brought before the magistrate for ringing the bell of Millbank Penitentiary without any proper cause. A constable says she was tugging at the rope and screaming. When asked why, she gives an answer that makes the courtroom laugh. She wanted to see the matron to ask after a friend. It is the kind of explanation that signposts two roads at once. On one, it is a jest, the dry wit of a regular returning to the gate. On the other, it is desperation and loneliness condensed into a single, absurd act. If no one in the city will open a door, ring the biggest one you can find. The judgment sends her to Holloway for 14 days. The occupation, ironer, locks neatly with what later records will say. It is a trade worth picturing. A board, a hot iron, steam, the hiss and press of creases tamed for other people's wages. A few months later, the 1891 census unspools more of the thread. Charlotte, 38, is no longer entered alongside John and the boys. Instead, she appears as a lodger at 50 Wilcox Road, Lambeth, sharing space with a widow, Caroline Taylor. The status line still reads, married, but the reality is a separate life. Her work is given as ironing, domestic labour that pays by the week or the piece, and the address tells you all you need to know about the precariousness of that income. Lodging houses inhale the poor and exhale them again when rent day goes wrong. In such rooms, possessions are portable, friendships provisional, and nights long. What follows is not a gentle decline, but a march of events that repeat with variations like a theme that cannot be shaken. In 1892, a report from Lambeth Police Court uses an adjective that clamps like a vice, dangerous. She is described as drunk and disorderly, but that was not the centre of the hearing. A solicitor speaking for the licensed Victualers Society rises to say there is another charge. Threats against Mr. Rushton, the manager of the Tankard Tavern at Kennington. The lawyer lays out a history, 4 or 5 separate occasions of window smashing at the pub, all punished, none deterring. A few days before the hearing, fresh from prison, she goes back to the same frontage with a brick for a plate glass pane. When the manager restrains her, she swears, in court and upon oath, that she will throw vitriol at him. Vitriol is not a metaphor, it is acid, sulphuric, carried, the solicitor claims, as if it were a pocket knife. The manager is said to live in fear. The magistrate does what magistrates do, sets sureties beyond reach, 2 recognizances of £25 or 2 months' hard labour. The sum is as unreal to her as a lottery prize. The jail is real. The line between grievance and fixation is now very thin. 1 year later, in June 1893, her name is back in print under a headline that reads like a pickled specimen label, "A drunken woman's mania." She has smashed a window at Holloway Prison itself, hurled a stone through a waiting room pane after being discharged earlier that day. The report adds this is the third time she has broken that particular glass. As if the window were an adversary she was determined to keep meeting. 2 months' hard labour is the answer. Another version of the story, in a different paper, adds a sentence that carries more weight than any headline. She has no home. There is a pattern here if you allow yourself to see it without either romance or contempt. The target is often an institution or a frontage that represents one, a pub that bars her, a prison that processes her, a great bell that belongs to a penitentiary. She hurls her anger at plate glass because it is the one surface that will listen with a noise loud enough to be heard. When the Tankard Tavern's manager stands up and says he fears vitriol, the courtroom acknowledges a reality that patrols already knew. In the 1890s, acid attacks appear in London's docket with distressing regularity, most often as instruments of revenge or coercion. Whether Charlotte ever truly carried a bottle, or only used the threat like a cudgel, the fear it generated was real enough to lengthen sentences and stiffen the tone of reports. Her name begins to migrate into the same paragraphs as notorious habituals of the day, women whose lives the press likes to summarise with a single trait: drunkard, vagrant, brawler, because the long reasons do not fit the column inches. It is worth pausing for the small, specific words that keep threading the documentary trail. Irona, which tells you where she finds cash between arrests. Lodger, which tells you where she sleeps if she can. Married, which tells you that in God's ledger she still belongs to someone who no longer lives with her. Dangerous, which tells you how institutions rationalise what they do next. The phrase "no fixed abode" will arrive soon enough and set like plaster. By the mid-1890s, reporters stop pretending that each incident is a surprise. They write about her with a voice that blends weariness with a tick-tock expectation. Released in the morning, arrested in the afternoon, barred at one door, showing up at the next, windows mended, windows gone again. An illustrated weekly, always keen for a lurid comparison, will later call her the successor to a well-known habitual drunk, as if notoriety were a job with a handover. The judgment is facile, but it tells you how the city has begun to slot her into a ready-made role. Not a mother who buried a child in the workhouse, and who prefers prison to a home, but a stock character meant to be clucked at over breakfast. Meanwhile, the geography of her life keeps shrinking to places with official ledgers, police courts, jails, and, when the century turns, registers kept under a new law that treats drink not only as a vice but as a condition to be managed by confinement. The scene is set for statutes to step in with a different kind of timeline, years rather than weeks. Before that arrives, though, there will be another sharp blow of glass at a familiar door in Kennington, another ledger entry at Holloway, and another census line that finds her not in a household but behind a wall. Trade intact, name fixed, and the city outside ticking on without noticing the difference. For now, imagine the Tankard Tavern at closing. Gaslights lowered, sawdust dampened, the manager's pocket jingling with keys, and near the door a ghost of white where putty meets new glass. Somewhere in Lambeth a lodging house settles into its night sounds. Coughs through thin walls, kettles cooling, stairs creaking under someone late. On a shelf, a flat iron leans where Charlotte left it. Tomorrow, if she is free, there will be sleeves to press and collars to smooth. If she is not, there will be laundry in the prison and a bell she will not be allowed to touch. Either way, the city will set its jaw and she will set hers, and the story will move on. Into law, into registers, into photographs that record what stone and river have already written on her face. By the mid-1890s, the city had learned her footsteps. Reporters no longer wrote of Charlotte with the curiosity offered to a stranger, but with the clipped, almost bored cadence reserved for the very familiar. In 1896, an illustrated weekly, ever hungry for a neatly labelled specimen, declared her the successor to one of the age's notorious habitual drunkards, an ugly sort of inheritance, as if disgrace were a title that passed from woman to woman when sorrow and gin did their patient work. The piece placed her at a Whitechapel house, the Sir John Barley Corn, accused again of damage. The phrasing turned on a phrase that stung. Aito Ike, us fancied grievance against a prior landlord, cherished for 7 or 8 years, and paid out in broken pains even after the man had moved on. Whether the grievance was imagined or inked into her bones, the ledger of repairs was real. She returned to the address like a moth to the same bruised pane, offering the same hard lesson. Some injuries are an orbit, not a line. Then, in August 1898, the old Kennington battleground returned to print. The South London press records Charlotte pleading guilty to smashing a plate of glass worth £10 at the Tankard Tavern. The same frontage, the same manager, the same clatter of putty knives after the constable's boots fade down the pavement. The prosecutor had tired of adjectives. He described her as a confirmed window smasher who, on stepping out of prison, would promptly commit some fresh mischief. A wardress produced a long roll of priors. The court answered with a heavier hammer, 12 months' hard labour. The sentence did not reform, it reset the clock. The turning of the century did not reset hers. If anything, it tightened the screws. When the enumerators came to count heads and habits for the 1901 census, she was not in a family home, nor in the kind of lodging that could be vanished from overnight. She was on the state's inventory. Charlotte, 49, married, inmate, Wormwood Scrubs. Even here the trade line followed her name, like a shadow. Irona. Inside or outside, the work was the same. Heat, pressure, repetition, and the slight, fleeting dignity of a garment made smooth for someone else's day. On release, the dance resumed with a bleak wit that did not amuse the benches. July 1902 produced a small, grimly comic item, headed with a phrase that could have served as a motto for her adult life. Come not to stay. The scene. She walks into the Tankard Tavern, and by way of announcing the occasion of her freedom, smashes a water jug. She had come, she said. That was all. It was a declaration that combined bravado and fatigue, celebration pitched as a dare, knowing the end of the sentence before the first word was said. 2 more months were measured out against her, but the state's methods were changing, and the pivot would define her remaining years. The new century gave the authorities a statute to gather women like Charlotte, not merely as offenders but as patients of a sort. Habitual inebriates, to be managed through confinement and discipline. In May 1903, the bureaucracy wrote her down, line by line, into its latest book, the Habitual Drunkards Register. This document has the chill of a ledger and the intimacy of a portrait. Age 51. Trade, ironer. Abode, none. Height, 4 feet 8. Hair, brown. Eyes, hazel. A scar on the back of the right hand. Teeth, deficient. Streets frequented, listed with the exactness of a mapmaker. A life that had been untidy, violent, sorrowing, reduced to measurements, marks, and a phrase that closes doors. No fixed. Abode. Summer slid toward autumn, and the registers were not the only papers her name visited. The Islington Gazette ran a little story, with a hard moral edge, titled Boots Lifted. The charge, stealing 3 boots from outside a shop. She ran. 1 boot fell. The constable ran faster. She was committed for trial. It was a petty theft by the measure of a rich city, the kind shopkeepers expected. Losses chalked up against custom, not ruinous but personal. For Charlotte, it came braided with something bigger than a single indictment. When the Evening Standard printed the October outcome, under a headline about blacklists and inebriates, the hearing folded 2 judgments into one. She admitted the petty theft, and the court recognised her as what the register had already recorded, a habitual drunkard. The sentence reached for a different lever. Not weeks in Holloway, not months of hard labour, but years in a home. 3 years in an inebriate reformatory were ordered. The bench expected compliance and, perhaps, gratitude. They got something else. Her reply was reported verbatim and rings with the old defiance sharpened by dread. "No," she said. "I'll burn it down. Sentence me to 5 years penal servitude. I don't mind that. But 3 years in a home, well, I'll get drunk the day I come out and come and see you again." It wasn't a speech rehearsed for effect. It was a true measure of her world. Prison was known, its terms almost domestic in their predictability. A home, with its supervision dressed as charity and its cure passing as kindness, felt like exile. The prison calendars, in their remorseless shorthand, confirmed what the headlines adorned. After 3 days in Holloway, she was removed to the state's inebriate reformatory at Aylesbury. 3 years of a new kind of containment. Those registers carried an extra column that looked backward, across time at an accumulation of smaller weights, dozens of sentences, mostly for damage, most as predictable as sunrise. The new confinement would not erase that past, it would only glue another label onto her file and store it on a different shelf. The logic of the inebriate home ran like a tract. Remove the habitual drinker from the temptations of the city, regulate her hours, set her to light manufacture or domestic labour, bring religion and routine to bear upon a craving that had wrecked both home and body. The theory was architectural. Walls were its first principle. For residents, it meant the long, polished corridors of a place that was neither hospital nor prison, and yet borrowed the worst features of both. The sense of being watched, and the sense that nothing personal could be retained. Hairbrushes numbered, uniforms issued, letters read, departures delayed. If the state's measure of success was obedience, then failure for many women looked like simple honesty. When faced with a choice between a punitive clarity, prison, and a moralizing blur, the home, they preferred the old cell and its familiar key. And yet, for all the structure and sermon, the reformatory years did not manage to shear Charlotte from the city that made and unmade her. Even while she was gone behind those doors, the places that had defined her remained: Kennington's frontage with its near-constant renovations, Whitechapel's tavern, where a landlord no longer resident still represented an insult freshly felt, the stone steps by the river of Southwark Bridge, where, more than once, cold water had taken the breath from her lungs before a uniformed arm dragged her back to air. The city is not just streets, it is an argument. She and London had been arguing for decades. The clearest signal that the new system could not do what it promised came not from a minister's report, nor a magistrate's sigh, but from the paper's shorthand, when she re-emerged. The story no longer needed to be told. It could be headlined with a knowing nod. When a woman's release is observed with the words, "Come not to stay," you understand that the gatekeepers and clerks had stopped expecting transformation and settled into expecting return. Not for the first time, Charlotte obliged their expectation and confirmed their poverty of imagination at once. Set beside these entries, you can still glimpse the domestic shadows that never fully left her. Even the driest record stubbornly repeats the occupation line. Ironeho. In a city that marked her as a menace, she still belonged to a trade built on restoring order, however briefly, to garments that would wrinkle as soon as worn. There is something almost tender in that contradiction. The woman prosecutors called dangerous earning coins by smoothing other people's collars, pressing creases into breast panels for mornings she would never see. Even in prison, she would have been set to laundry, the old motions carried into a new room. Linen boiled, sheets wrung, uniforms folded, wrists aching with the repetitive mercy of making one thing neat. By the time those 3 years were marked off at Aylesbury, the state kept track of people like her with a precision that felt, to the tract, like a net. A policeman could write an arrest and mean it to be just that. An administrator could bind those arrests into a category and make it a fate. Habitual drunkard was not a description for a day. It was a title you wore into every room, a shorthand that justified the next confinement and the next. And so, when she returned to the open city, the system that promised remedy had prepared both pavement and courtroom for the old result. The press, too, had learned its own habit. It would print her name with a tone polished by repetition, half scold, half shrug, while readers folded their papers on trains and imagined themselves safe from whatever private grief sent a woman to fight with glass. What lay directly ahead? The second entry in the register, complete with a pair of photographs, a fresh, unflinching look at a face more worn than before. The cold exchange in a courtroom where she told a magistrate plainly that she would choose jail over the gentle tyranny of a home. The knowledge stamped in lines and shadows that time had taken more than law ever could was already foreshadowed. In the last years of the 19th century and the first of the 20th, Charlotte had been named, measured, and confined. The next years would develop the image, sharper, harder, and in the end, heartbreakingly drained of light. The promise that a home would mend what prison could not did not survive contact with Charlotte's life. By early 1907, the newspapers found her again, unchanged in essence and sharpened by time. One South London report put it starkly: a small woman, recently discharged from an inebriate institution, back before the magistrate for drunken disorder. When the bench, doing its paternal best, floated the idea of another home, she answered, with the plain arithmetic of experience, she would rather go to prison. It was not bravado. To people who slept in lodging-house cubicles and worked for coins, prison had a perverse familiarity. Its punishments were finite and known, its rules at least honest about being rules. Home, dressed as cure, felt like a sermon stretched across years. The court signed fresh papers anyway. 3 more years, this time the East Harding inebriates home, were laid like a lid over the next season of her life. The bureaucracy, for its part, kept writing. Sometime that same year, a new entry was made in the habitual drunkard's register, a ledger with an appetite for detail and a taste for finality. The item is chilling not because of its prose but because of its images. Alongside the line of text, name, age, trade, marks, sit 2 photographs, frontal and profile, the modern state's way of saying, "We know you." 4 years earlier, in 1903, the first register portrait had shown a woman who, despite wear, still held a sliver of spark in the eyes, a small upward tension at the mouth that read almost as challenge. The 1907 pair made the subtraction visible. The jaw looked tighter, the gaze more fatigued, as if the face had learned the habit of bracing itself for whatever door would open next, the cell, the ward, or the courtroom. It is a terrible kindness that photographs can do, showing not a single bad night, but the slow geography of wear. Her identifiers never changed much. Height, 4 feet 8, hair brown, eyes hazel, scar back of right hand, teeth missing, occupation ironer, abode none. The little rectangles of paper made those 5 nouns into a life. You can picture the clerk dipping a pen, the quiet of the office, the sense that one more human being had been successfully formatted for storage. Meanwhile, outside that room, a publican replaced a pane and a turnkey counted keys, trades that prosper in a city where misery repeats. Time, of course, kept going. The next and final time the recorders caught her is 1912. The entry is stripped to essentials, and that is what makes it brutal. Age 58, trade ironer, address no fixed abode, charge habitual drunkard, disposition committed to a certified reformatory for 3 years. The accompanying photograph is the one you remember after you close the book, the one that steals the air for a second before returning it thin. There is no hint now of mischief, none of the old courtroom defiance. The eyes do not meet the lens, they foul it with indifference. The mouth has settled into the unchosen line people wear when there is no more argument left to stage. If the 1903 picture kept a last scrap of light, and the 1907 pair mapped its erosion, the 1912 portrait shows the final weathering, a coastline rounded by tides that will not stop. This is what grief, drink, and the state can do together when given 20 years and a woman with nowhere else to stand. What came after 1912, the paper does not say. Perhaps there was one more discharge and one more return, a small unremarked ceremony repeated in courtyards all over the city. A gate swings, a woman steps out, eyes adjust, and the old streets, Kennington, Lambeth, Whitechapel, reappear like sentences half remembered. More likely, the file concludes as so many do, with the last date, the last term measured out, and never officially closed. If there was a burial, it was under a different story's headline, on a page where names are crowded and columns are narrow. The archive for her ends with that final image, the way a road can stop at water. When you fall back to the beginning and move forward again, the pattern is not a mystery. A 14-year-old in South Hackney learns a trade and a family rhythm. Boots made, boots bound, the steady yield of piecework, and the ordinary promise of small money. A marriage at 18, church stone, borrowed flower, a signature in a parish book. Children arrive like bells rung in the house. John, Alfred, Charles, Albert. Then a fight, a plunge, a rescue, a magistrate's cold sentence, and 3 days later, a tiny boy dies in the workhouse with his mother's hand on him. After that, the years grow hard and narrow. A different address, a walking partner instead of a husband. The river again. Aliases pulled on as needed. Bank, Williams, Braftoft. The first pane broken for a grudge that never dissolves. Plate glass at a tavern brought down with a stone. Another pane, this time, at Holloway's waiting room. The great bell at Millbank rattled on its rope because a door would not open and the city would not answer. The press turns her into a type, the law turns her into a category, and the new century turns her into a set of photos. It may be tempting to cut the story to a single shard, window smasher, and hold it up as if it were the whole, but the archives resist that simplification if you let them. The same hand that hurled a brick for the Tankard Tavern's frontage ironed other people's collars to pay for a bed. The same woman who threatened vitriol rang a penitentiary bell to ask after a friend. The records note she was dangerous, and yet they also record every time a constable waded into cold water to pull her from an attempt, every time a sailor jumped, every time a court found 15 shillings for a man's lost boots and cap. Somewhere in that ledgered city, charity and condemnation walked arm in arm. There is a refrain that keeps returning: no fixed abode. Those 3 words produce the rest almost by themselves. Without a stable room, every decision the sober take for granted becomes precarious. Where to keep a change of clothes, where to be ill without eviction, where to carry the grief for a child without the neighbours hearing it through thin walls and complaining to a landlord. Drink then ceases to be merely a vice. It becomes both anaesthetic and trap, a quick warming room that charges you interest by the hour. The law, forced to manage what it cannot mend, does what it knows. It documents, confines, and returns. Meanwhile, the glass cracks again because glass is what listens loudest. If you want to draw a conclusion, let it be particular rather than grand. The state could record Charlotte. It could not repair her. The city could hire her hands for ironing. It could not house her grief. Newspapers could name her successor to a notorious woman, as if notoriety were a family trade. They could not spare a line for Alfred's grave. The people who saved her, Banfield from a brig, constables from stone steps, did not answer a philosophical question about free will and drink. They answered a specific cry and pulled a human being out of water. That is the measure that resists easy stories. It is customary, at the end of such an account, to make an emblem of the subject, to claim she stands for a class or an era. Resist that too. She does not stand, she endures. What her papers show is less a symbol than a sequence, a week in July 1868 that wrecks a life's bearings. A decade and a half where aliases become protective clothing. A string of pains, each one a brief, crashing argument with the world. A handful of photographs that show how a face answers the years. And the stubborn recurrence of a trade that tried in its tiny way to make things smooth. The last image, the one from 1912, refuses to flatter us with tidy themes. It shows a woman who is out of negotiations. If there is anything like a morality here, it is humble and unsatisfying. That people are not problems to be solved, but aches to be met. And that the gaps between those two sentences are where most of the damage is done. So we close the file where the document closes, with a small person made large by the paperwork of an empire. She began as a servant in a bootmaker's house, pressed her name into the parish register as a bride, held an infant in a police court before the week found its ending in a workhouse, warred and spent the next 4 decades rebounding between doors that never fully opened. The Tankard Tavern repaired its windows, the river kept its steps, the state kept its ledgers. Somewhere a flat iron hissed, and somewhere else glass fell like rain. If there is a lesson at all, it is simply to look long at that last photograph and remember that the face was once a girl in a census line, and that the distance between those 2 points is not just years but everything a city can take and everything it refuses to give back.